All right. Well, last chapter we talked about the tissue of bone. Well, all the tissues a little bit, but the tissue of bone we finished with. And now we're coming to the section where we look at all the bones. We'll start with the skull, and then we make our way through the bones, and we also make our way through the muscles in this chapter. So we actually start the skull, and then we'll do the muscle of the face, and then we'll keep going. So when you study for these things, when you want to remember these terms, one of the things you want to do is do labeling exercises. Because retrieval exercises, that means you're looking for a term until you find it, and then it goes, oh, that's what it was. That really makes the connections in your brain strong to remember these things. So I like to draw these bones. I like to, label them in blanks that I can label them on, etc., etc. All right, let's dive into it. Looking at the human skeleton, we can separate it into the bones that make up the trunk. See, that's the bluish stuff here. And then the bones that make up the appendages, the extremities that attach to the trunk. So the trunk is what runs basically the spinal column, up and down the skull. And inside the skull we got some little bones. And then the ribs and the breastbone as well, they make up the trunk. The sacrum is part of that too. That's part of the axial skeleton. So that's the median axis skeleton. Like in an axle in a car, you just put it upside down and then you got that human axis. And then from there we have the upper and the lower extremities attached to it, and those make up the appendicular skeleton. The upper extremities start with the pectoral girdle, the shoulder girdle, so to speak, and that's the scapula, that's the shoulder blade, and also your clavicle, and that's the collarbone. So those are the starting points of the appendicular skeleton. So those are good to remember. And then on the lower parts, we have the pelvic. That's the hip bone. And the pelvic is actually made up of three different bones. We'll learn those later. And then from there, the lower extremities attach to the axial skeleton. All right. The head is made up of the skull cap, and then the facial bones. Both of those are made up of multiple bones, even though to our eyes it looks like one bone. The connection between those bones are not like regular joints, but they're still joints, and we call them sutures. They're like the jagged lines that you can see right here. These are sutures. These are connections between bones. And so we have then multiple bones that attach and make to one another and make up a skull, and then multiple bones that attach to one another and make up the faces, the facial parts. These sutures are not like regular joints. They're more like really strong things that flex a little bit. They move a little bit, but they don't move like your shoulder or your arm. So don't. We'll have a chapter on joints. We'll talk about those a little bit more. Okay, so the skull cap, where the brain sits in, is made up of the frontal bone. Has one frontal bone. That's the one bone sits right in front of your face. Then we got two parietal bones. They come up on the side. They're the top caps on the side. And then behind the ears we have two temporal bones. In the back of the whole head we have an occipital bone. And then we got a couple of goofy ones. And the sphenoid bone is right behind the temple from side to side. It moves across this bone, the whole skull, which actually makes it kind of interesting because that means all the other bones that we just named are attached to that one bone. So that's interesting. Because when somebody has a concussion is when you hit your head real hard. Some of these sutures can get stuck and don't move quite right, and that can be a problem because the brain needs to breathe. Those joints move a little bit. You don't see that, but it moves a little bit in a rhythm. And when we have a concussion or when we hit the head real hard, sometimes they get stuck. And often that sphenoid bone is an interesting bone because we can move that sphenoid bone a little bit and unstuck all the other bones. And that's kind of an interesting thing that we could do. to help the concussion victims. And then we also have an ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone is behind the nose. There is a bone sitting there. And so those are make up the skull cap. And then the facial bones are made up by the maxilla, that's the upper teeth bone. The palatine bones, that's a roof of the mouth bone. The nasal bone, well, that's good, that's by the nose. The lacrimal bone, and the lacrimal bone is on the inside, right behind the nose, where the Sandman comes in, because that's the tear ducts that drain out the tears. So that's the lacrimal bone. And then we got the zygomatic bone, and that's the cheekbone. And then we got a bone called an inferior nasal concha, and that's like nasal. The conchas are interesting. Inside the nose, they make little round structures that when we breathe in, they slow down the air, and that has then we can, by the slowing down the air, we have a lot of blood vessels that go through these conchas, and they warm the air and they moisten the air, and so they prepare the air for going into the lungs, and so that's kind of helpful. So that's a very important structure, but it's, you know, a little bit special and goofy. And then the vomer bone is the right at the bottom of the nose. That's a vomer bone, a plow bone, that's called. And then the lower teeth are attached. The lower teeth are attached to the mandible. That's the last bone there. Oof, quite a bunch of them. So let's go through them. And let's look at those bones individually. The frontal bone makes the forehead. We have superciliary arches, and those are right where our eyebrows are. And our eyebrows are actually interesting because they help shade a little bit, make like little caps that the sun can't penetrate so steep in an angle, and so they protect the eyes through that. And then they also help the sweat to accumulate and not drip into the eyes and sting, because the sweat is very salty, so it stings. And then between those, right at the bottom of the nose, where the nose starts, is called the glabella. The glabella means hairless, and that's that area right in there. And well, that, you know, is often on the test because glabella rhymes with Isabella. That's my daughter's name, and so I often use that. So you want to remember that. The roof of the orbit, the top of the eye sockets, is also made up of the frontal bone. And then when we look at the inside of the skull, when we take sort of the top off, in like these models you can do that, you take the top off, you see areas where the brain sits, and we have a slide coming up of that. And so the frontal bone makes a large part of that area in the front, in the anterior, we call it the fossa, where the front of the brain sits in, which is actually the part of the brain that is your conscious thinking part, sort of thing. That's why you scratch your forehead, because that part needs more, you know, oxygen, and when you scratch your forehead, more blood gets into that area, sort of. And then also we have sinuses in the frontal bone, and sinuses are hollow chambers on the inside of the bone, and they make the bone not be so thick and so dense, and so they lighten the skull a little bit. But they also give us nice resonant chambers so that the voice can be magnified when we speak. It's kind of like the body of a guitar and an acoustic guitar. So the frontal bone is pretty interesting. The parietal bone is the next one that comes up here, and that forms behind the frontal bone. It means wall. So we have two. We have one on either side. And that's actually, you know, sort of a boring bone in some aspects for us to study. There's not that much that we can see on it. But we have a parietal eminence, and that's the widest part of the skull. So you can't really see a landmark on the skull there. So it's not really a testable sort of type place. But when, you know, the baby is born, that's an important part, because that's going to be where we squeeze the skull. And we're going to see about that squeeze. That's an interesting portion too in a suture that's coming up. But what we can see on that parietal bone is the superior temporal line. And that's right, this structure right here, this thing right here, this thing. And what is happening there is the temporal muscle. See this here? Right here? That's a muscle. That red thing is a muscle. And you see that white thing going down? That's a tendon going down and reaching into the lower jawbone and helping close the mouth. Oops. So that helps us in chewing. So that's an interesting landmark. So that's called a superior temporal line. All right, and look, this brings us to those jagged line things. See here? These are the jagged line things. So these bones don't quite connect, but there's only like a few cell thickness in between those connections. So there's not really that much of a gap at all, and they're very sort of stuck. But they do have some cells that indicate that they do a little bit of movement in there. And so there's a slight amount of movement in those sutures. So we have multiple ones of those. We have well, we have many, but we list a few. We list the coronal suture. The coronal suture goes right here between the frontal bone and the parietal bones collectively. It's like the corona means crown. It goes from side to side. And you can, I can feel mine, right? Sort of where the hairline is, a little bit behind. Well, my hairline is kind of there at this point. And then in the middle, going backwards, there's another suture, and that's the sagittal suture. That's between the parietal bones. And then I don't have the best picture of this here. When you go to the back and you look at the backbone here, the backbone is the occipital bone, you see a lambdoid suture that sort of goes down on either side. We have that in a picture. Hold on, I can show you that in a... No, I don't have that in a picture right there. But we'll see it in class. And then the last suture that I like a lot, in some ways, is not really a jagged one. This is an overlapping suture. It's called a squamous suture. Squamous is fried egg kind of looking stuff. But it's flat. Squamous means flat. So it's a flat suture right here on the side of the temporal bone and the parietal bone. Temporal bone will come up in a moment. So that's the bone behind the ear. And so those sutures overlap. So when the baby is born, the widest part of the skull, which is right here, by the parietal bone, needs to squeeze, and the parietal bone squeezes a little bit underneath the temporal bone, and that way the skull is not as wide, so it can be born and go through the birth canal. So that's kind of a cool thing, I think. And after the suture, that brings us right to the fontanelles. And the fontanelles are places where the sutures didn't quite connect yet, because this is when we are born, we have these fontanelles, these soft spots that we can feel in the baby. And, don't poke into them, because those are areas that in the previous chapter we talked about when we have intramembranous bone formation or ossification. We have membranes, and between the membranes the bones forms. And so these are areas where here is one, and then back here is another one, where those bones haven't quite filled into those membranes yet. And that helps, because when the baby's born, therefore, these places can be very flexible, and we can squeeze that skull without doing any damage and breaking anything. So we got one suture in the front called an anterior fontanelle, and one suture in the back called a posterior fontanelle. And this is very important and very interesting, because humans as a species are born prematurely because our energies have been put into brain power more than muscle power, and so our brains grow quite big compared to other animals in relationship to our body size. And so if the baby were born more maturely, those skulls would be more formed, and those brains would be bigger, and skulls would be bigger and more connected, and so it would be impossible for those babies to be born. So that's one reason why humans have a long period of raising children, because through evolution, that's just how it sort of played out, that the babies that are born premature were the ones that survived. And so it's an interesting thing. So those are the fontanelles right here. Okay, let's go to the temporal bone.